Welcome back to the deep dive. Today we're tackling a subject that really sits right at the heart of the modern planning profession.
We really are. And as your resident planning expert, I'm thrilled to be here to help break this all down for you. The topic that touches on this massive central tension in the field right now.
Exactly. It's that old assumption that real planning is something that only happens in government offices versus the actual reality of a rapidly growing private sector workforce.
Right, where the jobs actually are today.
Yeah. And for you listening, if you are prepping for your professional certification right now,
Which is a huge undertaking.
it really is. Whether you're taking the professional exam here in the States or in the UK or Australia, you should treat this deep dive as a comprehensive review of the core article on ethical principles in an increasingly diverse planning profession.
Examiners absolutely love this material because it challenges the status quo.
So true. Now, the core conflict of the article we're looking at today is that it's essentially a response piece. It was written to counter a very specific viewpoint published back in 2020 by Stefano Moroni.
Right, and just for some quick context, Moroni argued that when we talk about planning ethics, we should focus exclusively on public planning. So planning done by public authorities.
Which, that sounds reasonable on the surface, right? Planning is a public function.
It sounds totally logical.
But the authors of our source today are basically saying, hold on a second. They accept Moroni's focus for his own arguments, but they use it to launch this massive critique. They're saying that if we imply planning is only a state-led activity, we're ignoring a huge chunk of the profession.
A huge and growing chunk. And that brings us to our mission statement for this deep dive. We are going to explore the changing nature of the profession, specifically how ethical principles apply to private sector planners just as much as they apply to public ones.
Right.
Because we really need to dismantle the idea that working for a private firm somehow exempts you from serving the public interest.
Okay, so let's really unpack this. To understand why we even have this debate, the whole public versus private thing, we actually have to look backward. This source takes us on a bit of a history trip to explain the origin stories of planning in different countries.
It's fascinating how the DNA of the profession differs depending on where you are. It's comparative history at its best. The authors argue that the reason the UK and Australia view planning differently than the USA comes down purely to how the profession started.
So let's start with the UK and Australia. How did it begin over there?
Well, in the UK, planning was born as a direct extension of public control over private land. You really have to look at the 1909 Housing and Town Planning Act. That specific legislation made town planning a statutory function of local government.
So from day one,
From the very birth of the profession, yeah.
if you were a planner, you were directly employed by the state. You were a bureaucrat in the machinery of government.
The identity of the planner was basically synonymous with public servant. You didn't really have an identity outside of that structure. Precisely. And Australia followed a very similar path. In the early 20th century, planning was introduced there to counter unchecked development. By the 1960s, the role of the Australian planner was absorbed almost completely into the public bureaucracy.
Wow.
So in those regions, that public sector mindset is just the default setting.
Okay, so that's the UK and Australia. But the US has a totally different flavor, doesn't it? We tend to do things a bit differently here.
A very different flavor. In the early years of American planning, very few municipalities actually had full-time planners on staff. The dominant figure wasn't the bureaucrat. It was the private practitioner.
Like a consultant.
Exactly. Cities would contract these private experts to come in and write their plans for them. So while they were doing public works zoning, master plans, that sort of thing, they were not public employees. This established a client-contractor relationship right from the birth of the profession in the U.S.
And for you listening, that distinction is absolutely crucial to grasp for your exam, because in the UK model, the planner is the government. In the US model, the planner is hired by the government.
That is the key takeaway there. And that historical DNA completely affects how we talk about ethics today. In the U.S., the idea of a private planner having ethical duties is old news because they've always been around. But in the UK and Australia, the recent rise of the private sector feels like this massive disruption to the natural order.
And speaking of disruption, this is where it gets really interesting. The landscape is shifting dramatically right now. If you are taking notes for your exam, this is the section you want to pay close attention to because the data here is striking.
We are talking about a major structural shift.
Let's run through these numbers. The source gives us a snapshot using professional membership data, which really highlights why this public sector only view is totally outdated. Let's look at the proportion of planners working in the private sector,
Okay, let's do it. In the USA, about 21% work in the private sector.
which is significant. It's about 1 in 5, but it's still a minority compared to the public sector.
True, but then look at the UK. 39% of planners are now in the private sector.
That is nearly double the U.S. rate. That's a massive chunk of the workforce.
And then there's Australia, a staggering 55% work in the private sector.
Wait,
Yeah,
55%. So in Australia, being a private planner is actually the norm, not the exception. If you meet a planner in Sydney, they're statistically more likely to work for a consultancy than the local city council. But
exactly. The majority of the profession down there is private, but the UK figure is perhaps the most shocking because of how incredibly fast it happened. In 2013, only 22% of UK planners were private. By 2019, it hit 39%.
that is a massive structural shift in just 6 years.
It really is.
So what caused this surge? Especially in the UK, planners don't just leave the public sector in droves for no reason.
The source identifies four main drivers, and you definitely need to know these for the exam. The first, and arguably the biggest, is austerity.
Budget cuts.
Deep, deep cuts. UK local authority budgets fell by around 50% over a decade. Imagine trying to run a planning department with half the money. They simply couldn't afford to keep staff.
So the planners leave because the jobs disappear. But the work, the applications, the regulations, that still needs to be done.
Right, which leads perfectly into the second driver, which is deregulation. The development industry has flourished, creating way more demand for private planning advice.
Okay, austerity and deregulation. What's the third?
Complexity. New regulations, like the 2008 Planning Act in the UK, made the system so unbelievably complicated that you needed highly specialized expertise. Expertise that local governments just didn't have in-house anymore because of those budget cuts.
So they have to hire consultants to navigate the rules they're actually supposed to be enforcing? That's a vicious cycle.
It is. And that leads to the fourth factor, which the authors call reluctant outsourcing.
Reluctant outsourcing. I really like that term. It implies they aren't doing it because they think privatization is inherently better.
Exactly. It implies they aren't doing it because they want to. Public sectors have been so hollowed out that they must contract out their statutory functions just to keep the lights on. It's not an ideology, it's literally just survival.
That puts a whole new spin on the public versus private debate. It's not always a choice.
Precisely. And just to broaden the scope briefly for you guys studying, this isn't happening everywhere in the exact same way. The source mentions that in France, there is still very little private involvement. But in places like Italy and Greece, there's a growing negotiation-based culture that involves the private sector a lot more. And graduates across Europe are increasingly moving into the real estate sector.
But generally, the Anglosphere, the UK, Australia, the US is seeing this huge hybridization, which actually brings us to a really interesting gap in the academic literature. The source points out that American scholars have written a lot more about private planning ethics than anyone else. Why is that?
Well, it goes right back to that history we just discussed. Because the U.S. has always had that private practitioner model, the debate about public versus private is very mature here. American scholars have been wrestling with these ethical questions since the 70s and 80s.
Whereas in the UK and Australia,
In the UK, the assumption was always that planning is a public activity done in the public interest. There was no need to debate private ethics because, theoretically, private planning wasn't the main game. It is only recently, with that massive surge in private sector employment, that we're seeing self-reflection on this in the UK and Australia. The academic literature is basically playing catch-up with the reality on the ground.
so we have established that private planning is huge and it's growing. Now we really need to get to the meat of the argument for the exam, ethics. The authors are responding directly to Stefano Moroni's ethical principles. Let's look at what Moroni actually proposed in 2020. What were his principles?
Moroni identified three core ethical duties for public planners. 1. Perform quality work. 2. Adhere to duties of justice, which in this context basically means being honest and truthful. And 3. Always be accountable.
This seemed pretty universal. I mean, who would argue against quality, honesty, and accountability?
That is exactly the author's point. Moroni framed these as duties for the state planner. But our authors argue that there is absolutely nothing in those three principles that makes them exclusive to the government. They apply to everyone.
So just because you work for a private firm doesn't mean you get a pass on being honest or doing good work?
Correct. And the professional bodies totally back this up. If you look at the codes of conduct for the RTPI, or the AICP in the US, or the PIA in Australia, these codes apply to you regardless of who signs your paycheck. For instance, The RTPI principles include competence, honesty, independent judgment, due care, and respect. None of those say only if you work for the city council.
Right, but surely it is harder for a private planner. I mean, let's be real here. They have a client. The public planner works for the people, which is a bit abstract. But the private planner works for a developer who wants a permit and they want it yesterday.
This is what we call the client dilemma, and it is the specific ethical challenge for the private sector. How do you manage a client relationship while sticking to your core planning values? This is where the source gets into some heavy philosophical frameworks, but they are crucial for understanding the ethical logic for your exam. We need to talk about deontological versus consequentialist views.
Okay, let's break these down for the listener. These terms pop up in exams all the time. Let's start with deontological.
Right. A deontological view focuses on duty and rules. From this perspective, loyalty to a client could be seen as absolute. If you are their agent, your duty is to them, period. You follow the contract.
Which is super problematic if they want to build something terrible, like a toxic waste dump next to a primary school. If
Yeah.
you're purely deontological, you might say, well, my duty is to get them the permit.
Exactly. That is the major danger of pure loyalty. And that is where the consequentialist view comes in. This looks at the outcomes. It says loyalty is important, but it is not absolute if it leads to undesirable consequences. It weighs the actual impact of the action.
So how is this resolved in the real world? Which framework do planners actually use?
The professional codes of conduct essentially force a consequentialist approach. They prevent unconditional loyalty. The RTPI code, for example, explicitly states that members must act for the benefit of the public. That duty overrides the duty to the client.
So even if you are paid by a private developer, your license to practice depends on you serving the public interest first.
That is the theory. If your client wants something that blatantly violates the public interest, your professional code says you have to say no, or at least try to modify the proposal. You cannot just hide behind, I was just following orders.
But the source asks a bigger, more normative question here. Can private planners actually behave ethically in practice? Or is the pressure for profit just too high?
There is definitely a strong stereotype here. The academic world, especially in Europe, tends to view the market as the bad guy.
Yeah, the idea that if you work for the private sector, you've essentially gone to the dark side.
Yes, there's a tendency to see private planners as profiteers or willing collaborators in capitalism. There is a specific critique in the source that suggests students are often taught they have to choose. You either be profit-driven or you be value-driven.
But the authors call this a false binary.
They do. They argue that is a really lazy distinction.
Yeah.
It is entirely possible to acknowledge the need for profit while focusing on positive impacts and values. You don't have to be a martyr to be ethical. You can run a successful business and still care about good planning.
They also critique another scholar who had a very compartmentalized view of this.
Yes, they critique the view that equity planning is only for government, radical planning is for NGOs, and private planners are basically left out of the picture entirely. The authors argue this completely erases the identity of the private planner. It assumes they have zero agency to do good.
And they counter this with the idea of the activist private planner. This is a concept I really love. The idea that you can drive change from the outside.
It is a really powerful reframing. Instead of seeing private planners as mercenaries, the authors suggest they can act as the conscience in developer discussions.
That's a great image. Being the person in the boardroom who says, hey, we can make money, but we also need to address climate change and social value.
And sometimes they can do this way more effectively than the public planners. Think about it. Public planners are often bogged down by bureaucracy and local politics. They are seen as the regulator, the enemy. A trusted private consultant might be able to push a developer toward a greener, more equitable project because they actually have the developer's ear. They can frame it as risk management or future-proofing.
That makes a lot of sense. But is there any real evidence that private planners actually think this way, or is this just wishful thinking to make us feel better about privatization?
There is empirical evidence. The source cites a major U.S. study from 2013. They surveyed planners across sectors and found a remarkable convergence in values. Both groups basically wanted the exact same things for their cities: sustainability, equity, good design.
So they share the same goals, just different employers.
Exactly. And there was a UK study, too, in 2019. They found very few differences in how planners tried to behave ethically, regardless of which sector they were working in.
So the evil private planner versus the saintly public planner is mostly a myth.
The data certainly suggests so. The values align, even if the daily pressures differ. The private planner might face intense pressure from a client, while the public planner faces intense pressure from politicians. Both have to navigate ethical minefields every single day.
This has been a fascinating look at the identity of the profession. As we wrap up, let's recap the main takeaways for anyone heading into an exam. If you get a question on this article, what are the 3 things you absolutely need to remember?
Okay, first, the profession is becoming increasingly private. Especially in Australia and the UK, the days of planning being solely a state function are over. You need to know those trends, remember the figures for the UK and Australia, and the drivers: austerity, deregulation, complexity, and reluctant outsourcing.
Got it. Structural shift is point 1. What's point 2?
Second, ethics are universal. Moroni's principles of quality, justice, and accountability apply to the private sector just as much as the public. The code of conduct does not stop at the door of a consultancy firm. You need to understand that the public interest is paramount in the code of conduct, and it completely overrides the client interest.
And the third takeaway?
The profit versus public interest binary is false. Private planners can and do serve the public interest. They can be activists from within the market, sometimes acting as the conscience of development. Don't fall into the trap of thinking private automatically equals unethical.
Excellent summary. The authors actually wrap up the article by noting a significant research gap. They are launching more research to understand this hidden work. Because so much of what private planners do happens behind closed doors, we don't always see those ethical battles being fought in the boardroom.
It's a great reminder that we need to understand the nuance of private practice, rather than just dismissing it as purely commercial. We need to see how these negotiations actually happen in real time.
Now, before we sign off, here's a thought to leave you with. We talked about private planners acting as the conscience of developers.
Right.
If that is true, and if the public sector continues to be hollowed out by budget cuts, consider this. Is the regulatory state, the government, actually the most effective place to drive progressive planning changes anymore? Or has the center of power, and therefore the center of ethical responsibility, shifted permanently to the private consultant?
That is a deeply provocative question.
Mhm.
If the government is just rubber stamping because they lack resources, then the private consultant isn't just an advisor, they become the de facto guardian of the public interest.
It changes the whole weight of the profession. A scary or perhaps empowering thought, depending on where you sit. Thanks for listening to this deep dive. Good luck with your exam, stick to those ethical codes, and we will catch you next time.